Part 1. The letters. The letters smelled of distance, of dust and engine smoke, and the faint sweetness of lavender sachets she had tucked between the pages months ago, back in another life, in a rented room in Pennsylvania, where the walls were thin enough to hear her neighbor's prayers. Thea Whitfield sat on the porch of a dead man's cabin, watching the sun climb over the Wind River Range and read the words she had memorized so thoroughly they had become part of her breathing. Sometimes I stand at the fence line where my land meets the sky, and I think the loneliness isn't the worst of it. The worst is knowing that beauty this big was meant to be witnessed by two people, and I am only one. She folded the letter along its well-worn creases and pressed it against her chest. The paper had gone soft as cloth from handling the ink beginning to fade at the edges. 14 letters, 5 months of correspondence. She had carried them across half a continent in a carpet bag with a broken clasp, and now she sat on the porch of the man who had written them. Except he was 3 weeks in the ground when she arrived, and the earth over his grave was still dark with newness. That had been July. Now October was bleeding into November, and the aspens on the ridge had turned the color of old coins, and Theda Whitfield was still here, still reading letters from a dead man, and wondering why his voice felt closer to her now than it ever had when he was alive. A small sound from the doorway. Thea turned to find Wren standing there in her nightdress, dark hair wild from sleep, clutching the cloth doll, with the button eyes and the lopsided smile. The child said nothing. She had not spoken a word in 8 months, not since the February morning when her mother stopped breathing and the silence had settled over her like snow over a landscape covering everything, muffling every sharp edge until the world beneath was unrecognizable. Thea patted the empty space on the bench. Wren crossed the porch on bare feet, climbed up, and leaned into her side. The child's body was warm and light, all bird bones and shallow breath, and the trust in that leaning was so absolute that Thea had to close her eyes against the ache of it. They sat together in the early light. A magpie called from the fence post. The cattle were moving in the near pasture, dark shapes against the frost-silvered grass. And from the direction of the barn came the sound of boots on hard ground, the creak of a gate, the low murmur of a man talking to horses, the way some men talk to God, quietly, honestly, with no expectation of an answer. Beckett Calloway rounded the corner of the barn, carrying a pail of fresh milk steam rising from it into the cold air. He was tall and angular, built like a fence post, all vertical lines and weathered surfaces. His dark hair needed cutting, and his jaw carried 2 days of stubble. And his hands when he set the pail down on the porch steps were the kind of hands that had forgotten what softness felt like. He looked at Thea. He looked at his daughter pressed against her side. Something moved behind his eyes, quick and painful like a fish turning in deep water. Then it was gone. "Morning," he said. "Morning. Coffee is on." "Obliged." 3 words each. This was their language now, spare and functional, built for efficiency the way frontier tools were built. No wasted motion, no ornament. And yet beneath those 3 words lay something neither of them had named, something that had been growing since the night he'd first appeared at her door with his silent daughter and his worn-out boots and his careful, careful eyes. They ate breakfast at the kitchen table. Thea had made biscuits and fried 2 eggs in bacon fat and sliced the last of the dried cookies into a bowl. Wren ate slowly, methodically, the way she did everything each bite, considered each swallow deliberate. She no longer hid food in her pockets. That had stopped in the 3rd week when she finally believed there would be more tomorrow. Beckett ate the way a man eats when he has spent years measuring meals against uncertainty. Grateful without showing it. Thorough without rushing. He held his coffee cup with both hands, and Thea noticed, as she noticed every morning, how his fingers curved around the ceramic with a gentleness that seemed borrowed from someone else, someone who handled fragile things for a living. She caught herself staring and looked away. Through the window, the cottonwood by the creek was shedding its leaves, each one spiraling down like a small gold surrender. "Wind shifting," Beckett said. "Snow before the week's out. The north fence still needs mending. I'll get to it today." Another silence. Wren's spoon clinked against her bowl. The fire popped in the hearth. And somewhere in the quiet between these ordinary sounds, Thea heard the echo of words written on paper 5 months ago. Words she knew by heart. Words that had brought her across 1,000 miles to this table this morning. This man she had never been meant to meet. "Beckett," she said, and he looked up, and she forgot what she was going to say. Or rather, she remembered that what she wanted to say was not something that could be said over biscuits and eggs on a Tuesday morning. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Nothing, she said. More coffee? He held out his cup. The wind picked up outside, rattling the glass in the window frame. Winter was coming, and with it all the things that cold and darkness bring to the surface. But that was later. For now, there were biscuits. Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. 8 months earlier, March of 1883, the room cost 40 cents a night and smelled of boiled cabbage and regret. Theda Whitfield sat on the narrow bed with the newspaper spread across her knees, circling advertisements with a pencil stub. She had been a school teacher for 11 years, had buried both parents, sold the family home to pay her mother's medical debts, and was now 31 years old with $12 to her name, no prospects, and a rented room that leaked when it rained. The advertisement was 3 lines long, tucked between a notice for patent medicine and a listing for farm equipment. Rancher seeks wife, Wyoming territory, must be willing to work hard and love wide open spaces. Honest man of modest means, but good character. Write to E. Thornton General Delivery, Copper Creek, Wyoming. She read it 3 times. Honest man of modest means. She almost smiled. A man advertising for a wife in a newspaper was either brave or desperate, and she understood both conditions intimately. She wrote back that evening, sitting cross-legged on the bed with the lamp turned low to save oil. Her handwriting was a teacher's handwriting, clear and deliberate, each letter formed with the precision of someone who believed that words were the most important things a person could make. She told him about the school, about her students, about the way the Susquehanna River looked at sunset. She did not tell him about the debts or the loneliness or the way she sometimes woke at 3 in the morning and listened to the silence and thought, this is what the rest of my life sounds like. She sealed the letter and walked to the post office in the rain. 600 miles west, in a cabin that smelled of wood smoke and leathers, Emmett Thornton is sat at his kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper and a bottle of ink he had bought in town that morning. He was 38 years old, built like a draft horse, with hands that could gentle a calf or split a rail with equal ease. He could read well enough to manage, could sign his name, and make out a bill of sale. But writing real writing, the kind that a school teacher from Pennsylvania would expect, was beyond him. He had tried 3 times. The first attempt read, Dear Miss Whitfield, your letter was real nice. I have cattle. He stared at it, read and crumpled the paper, and threw it in the fire. The second attempt was worse. By the third, he was sweating. He pushed back his chair and went outside, standing in the yard while the March wind cut through his shirt. Across the fence line, he could see smoke rising from the Calloway place. Beckett Calloway, his nearest neighbor, his only real friend in the valley. Beckett, whose mother had been a school teacher back in Ohio, who had taught her son to read and write before consumption took her when the boy was 12. Beckett, who read books in the evening, the way other men played cards quietly without apology, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Emmett walked across the field. The Calloway cabin was smaller than his, tidier in its proportions, but powder raw with fresh grief. Lorna Calloway had died 3 weeks ago, the fever taking her in stages, each one more cruel than the last. The curtains she had sewn still hung in the windows. Her garden tools still leaned against the wall, waiting for hands that would never come. Beckett answered the door with his daughter on his hip. Wren was 7 small for her age, with her father's dark hair and her mother's wide gray eyes. She had not spoken since the funeral. She watched Emmett from the shelter of her father's arms and said nothing, her cloth doll pressed against her cheek like a talisman. Beck, Emmett said, and stopped. He turned his hat in his hands. I need to ask you something. It's foolish. Come in. They sat at the table while Wren curled on the hearth rug with her doll and her drawing book. Emmett produced the letter from his coat pocket, Thea's letter, and smoothed it flat on the table with his calloused palm. There's a woman, he began, and told the story. The advertisement, the reply, the handwriting so fine it looked like music on the page. She writes like she talks to God, Emmett said quietly, and I can barely spell my own name right. I can't write back to her, Beck. Not the way she deserves. Beckett read the letter. His expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes, the way light shifts when a cloud passes. Thea's voice came through the ink and paper with startling clarity. Warm, precise, carrying a loneliness so dignified it barely registered as loneliness at all. You want me to write for you, Beckett said. Not a question. Just help me say what I mean, in better words than mine. Beckett looked at the letter again. He looked at his daughter silent on the rug. He looked at the empty chair where Lorna used to sit, where she would read aloud to him in the evenings, her voice filling the cabin with stories that made the walls disappear. All right, he said, tell me what you want to say. They worked for 2 hours. Emmett would speak haltingly, describing his land, his cattle, his days. Beckett would listen, then write, translating Emmett's rough-hewn feelings into sentences that breathed. It was honest work, at first. The words were Emmett's in spirit, if not in letter. But then Emmett said, tell her about the sunsets here. And Beckett began to write, and something happened. The pen kept moving, past the point where Emmett's meaning ended, and something else began. He described the way the light came through the mountains in the evening, how it turned the stone from gray to amber, to a deep, impossible rose. How standing in that light felt like standing inside a church made entirely of scone. He wrote about silence, how it was different here than anywhere else, not empty, but full, the way a held breath is full. He wrote about loneliness, not Emmett's loneliness, but his own, the kind that had settled into his chest the night Lorna died and had not lifted since. He stopped writing. Read it back. Every word was true, but not every word was Emmett's. That's real good, Beck, Emmett said from across the table. Keep that part. Beckett hesitated. Then he kept it. The present. October 1883. By midday, the sun had burned off the frost and the world turned golden. Thea and Beckett worked the fence line along the north pasture, replacing posts that had rotted through and restringing wire that winter would test. Wren followed at a distance, collecting interesting rocks and arranging them in patterns on flat stones, a private language of shape and color that only she understood. They stopped for lunch under the big cottonwood by the creek. Thea unpacked bread and cold beef and a jar of pickled beets. Beckett filled their canteens from the stream. They ate without speaking much, the comfortable silence of people who had learned each other's rhythms. I used to eat lunch at my desk, Thea said. A sandwich and an apple grating papers while the children played outside. I could hear them through the window. Laughing, shouting. I always thought the loneliest sound in the world was children laughing when you don't have any of your own. She said it simply, without self-pity, the way she said most things. Beckett looked at her and then at Wren, who was kneeling by the creek watching minnows in the shallows with the absolute concentration that children bring to small wonders. She's been happier, he said, since we started coming here. She's been safer. There's a difference. Is there? Thea considered. Maybe not. Maybe happy and safe are closer than I thought. Wren came back to the blanket and settled beside Thea, opening her leather drawing book. She drew with the same quiet intensity she brought to everything, her pencil, moving in sure small strokes. Thea watched from the corner of her eye, letting the child work without interruption. Then she saw the picture. 3 figures standing before a house. The small one in the middle with dark hair and a doll. The tall figure on the right, clearly female, with hair colored in careful gold strokes. And the figure on the left, the man tall and broad-shouldered. But his hair was not dark like Beckett's. It was light-shaded with the same pencil strokes Wren used for the sun. Thea stared. Wren was drawing someone who was not her father. Someone with lighter hair. Someone who looked like he might have looked like Emmett Thornton, the man in the photograph that still hung above the fireplace, the man Thea had never met. A small, cold finger touched her spine. She did not know why. Wren looked up, caught Thea watching, and closed the book quickly, pressing it against her chest. Her eyes were wide, not with guilt exactly, but with the wariness of a child who has revealed something without meaning to. Thea smiled and said nothing. She offered Wren a pickle. But all afternoon, as they worked the fence and checked the cattle and hauled water from the pump, that drawing stayed with her. The light-haired man, the family that was and wasn't. The child who could not speak, but who saw everything. The letters kept coming throughout that spring and early summer of 1883, crossing the distance between Wyoming and Pennsylvania, like birds migrating between seasons. 1 letter every 2 weeks, sometimes more. Each one from Wyoming grew longer, deeper, more intimate. Each one from Harrisburg answered in kind. Beckett wrote them all. At first, he maintained the pretense of transcription, sitting with Emmett at the kitchen table, listening as the rancher stumbled through what he wanted to say, then smoothing it into prose. But gradually the process changed. Emmett would give him a subject, tell her about the new foal, Explain why I like this land, and Beckett would write without further instruction, pulling from somewhere inside himself, words that surprised them both. He wrote about the sound of the creek in spring when the snowmelt came down from the mountains and turned the water white with urgency. He wrote about the way a horse's breathing sounded in a dark barn, slow and certain, a metronome of trust. He wrote about grief without naming it, describing instead the way certain rooms held the shape of absent people, how a chair could look occupied if the light was right, how the smell of lavender soap could stop a man mid-step and pin him to a memory so sharp it drew blood. Thea's letters back were extraordinary. She wrote about her students, each one rendered in such vivid detail that Beckett felt he knew them. She wrote about the river in different seasons, about her mother's illness and death, with a clarity that was almost surgical, cutting away sentiment to find the bone of truth beneath. She wrote about loneliness with the same precision she brought to grammar diagramming it, the way she diagrammed sentences, subject, and predicate, cause and effect. Sometimes I think loneliness is just a word for the space where a person should be, she wrote. Not the absence itself, but the shape of it. The way you can see where a picture hung on a wall long after it's been taken down. A rectangle of brighter paint perfectly preserved. That's what loneliness is. Brighter than the rest, because it was protected from the dust and light that wear everything else down. Beckett read that passage and sat motionless for a long time. Wren was asleep in the next room. The cabin was quiet. He was 33 years old and his wife was 2 months dead, and he was falling in love with a woman through the mail, a woman who did not know his name, who thought she was writing to a man named Emmett Thornton, who believed the words she loved were coming from a different hand. He knew he should stop. He knew that every letter deepened the deception, that every beautiful sentence he wrote was a brick in a wall that would eventually have to come down. But when he sat at the table with the paper before him and the lamp casting its small circle of light, and he thought about what Thea would read when the letter reached her, how she would hold the page and hear a voice she was learning to love, he could not stop. The writing was the only place where his grief and his longing met without destroying each other. It was the only conversation he was having with anyone who heard him. Emmett read every letter before it was sent. Sometimes he laughed at the finer phrases, shaking his head in wonder. "You make me sound like a poet, Beck." Sometimes he grew quiet, sensing depths in the words that went beyond neighborly assistance. But he never questioned, never accused. Perhaps he understood. Perhaps he was grateful enough not to look too closely at the gift. "She'll be a good wife," Emmett said one evening, holding the latest letter. "Coming all this way for a man she's never met takes a certain kind of courage." "Or a certain kind of desperation," Beckett replied, then regretted it immediately. But Emmett only nodded. "Those aren't so different out here." The present again, evening. The cabin filled with lamplight and the smell of venison stew. Thea had found the recipe in a book on Emmett's shelf, one of the few books he owned, a battered copy of a homesteader's guide with notes scrawled in the margins in handwriting she now recognized as not Emmett's. But she had not yet made that connection. That would come later. Wren sat on the hearthrug while Thea showed her how to mend a tear in her apron. The child's small hands were careful, almost reverent, drawing the needle through fabric with the concentration of someone learning a sacred art. Thea guided her, gently covering Wren's fingers with her own, demonstrating the rhythm. Small stitches close together. That's what keeps things from coming apart. Beckett sat across the room with a bridle in his lap, working oil into the leather. He was not watching them. He was very deliberately not watching them, keeping his eyes on his hands, on the familiar work of maintaining tack. But his hands had slowed and the oil was pooling in the same spot he had been working for several minutes. And if anyone had looked closely, they would have seen the tension in his jaw, the effort it cost him to sit in this room with these two people and pretend that what was happening was ordinary. Thea spoke without looking up from the sewing. "There was a line in one of Emmett's letters," she said, threading a new length of cotton. "He wrote that the land here doesn't forgive carelessness, but it rewards patience. I think about that every time I mend something." Beckett's hands stopped on the leather. "He had a way with words," Thea continued. "In his letters, at least. It's strange, people in town don't talk about him that way. They say he was quiet, practical, but in those letters, he was." She paused, searching for the right word. "Eloquent," she finished. "He was eloquent." Beckett stood up abruptly. "Needs more oil," he said, gesturing vaguely at the bridle, and went outside. Thea watched the door close behind him. She looked down at Wren, who had paused her sewing and was staring at the door with an expression that Thea could not read. "Your father's a restless man," Thea said gently. Wren looked at her. Then she looked at the bundle of letters on the shelf tied with their blue ribbon. Then she looked back at Thea, and something in the child's eyes, some knowledge too heavy for a 7-year-old face, made Thea's breath catch. But Wren returned to her sewing and the moment passed, and Thea told herself it was nothing. Later, she wrote in her journal by candlelight, "Sometimes Beckett says things uses certain phrases, and I feel as though I'm hearing Emmett's letters spoken aloud. Perhaps the land shapes everyone's language the same way. Perhaps living under this sky you can't help but become a poet." She did not write what she felt beneath that thought, the strange warmth that came when Beckett spoke the way his voice seemed to fit inside the words she had fallen in love with on paper. She did not write it because writing it would make it real, and she was not ready for it to be real. Not yet. The storm came 2 days later, earlier than anyone expected. It began as a steel gray thickening of the sky in the west, the mountains disappearing behind a wall of cloud that moved with the slow inevitability of a closing door. By noon, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. By 3 o'clock, the first snow was falling, not the gentle flurries of a normal October, but a hard driving snow that came sideways on a wind that screamed through the valley like something wounded. Beckett had been repairing the corral gate when the storm hit. He finished the last nail by feel his fingers numb and fought his way to the porch where Thea was pulling in the laundry she had hung that morning. The sheets snapped and twisted in the wind like panicked birds. "You can't ride home in this," Thea shouted over the gale. He knew it. His place was 2 miles west, and 2 miles in a plains blizzard was as good as 200. They brought the horses into the barn, broke the ice forming on the water trough, and secured every door and shutter they could reach. Then they retreated inside where the fire was already burning high, and Wren was sitting on the rug with her doll watching the snow assault the windows with round, solemn eyes. By evening, the cabin had become an island. The wind howled without ceasing, and the snow piled against the north wall in drifts that reached the windowsills. Inside, the fire held its ground, casting a warm circle of light that made the cold beyond feel like another country. They ate supper. Wren fell asleep on the rug afterward, her doll tucked under her chin, one small hand reaching out to rest on Thea's ankle. Thea covered her with a quilt and did not move her foot. Beckett sat across the hearth, staring into the flames. "She trusts you," he said quietly. "She doesn't trust easily, not anymore. Children know who's safe. So do wounded animals. It's the same instinct." Thea poured them both more coffee. Outside, the wind found a gap somewhere in the walls and whistled through it a thin high note that sounded like a question. "Tell me about Lorna," she said. He looked up. "You don't have to. But we've been working side by side for 2 months, and I know your horse's name and your daughter's shoe size and how you take your coffee, but I don't know anything about the woman you love. And I'd like to." Beckett was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his words came slowly chosen with the care of a man walking across ice. "She was better than me in every way that mattered. Kinder, braver, more patient. She could talk to anyone, make anyone feel like the most important person in the room. I was never good at that." He paused. "She'd died in February. Fever came on a Tuesday, took her by Saturday. 4 days. That's all it took to end 17 years of being together. I've had headaches that lasted longer than her dying." His voice was steady, but his hands were not. Thea saw the tremor and said nothing. Wren was with her at the end. "I was in the barn tending a sick calf." "A sick calf." He laughed, a terrible sound. By the time I came in, Lorna was gone, and Wren was sitting beside her, holding her hand, not making a sound. She hasn't made a sound since. The fire shifted, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Wren stirred in her sleep, but did not wake. "You speak well," Thea said softly, "for someone who says he's not good at it." Something crossed Beckett's face, quick and bright and painful, like lightning in a closed room. He opened his mouth, then closed it, looked away. "I should check the barn," he said and rose. "In this storm, animals get scared." He pulled on his coat and went out into the howling dark. Thea listened to his boots on the porch steps, then nothing swallowed by the wind. She sat by the fire with his sleeping daughter at her feet and his words still warm in the air around her. And she thought about the letters in her carpet bag, the ones that smelled of distance, and she thought about how the voice in those letters and the voice of the man who had just walked into a blizzard to escape her questions sounded exactly the same. June of 1883, 5 months before, the thing that changed everything. Emmett Thornton died on a Tuesday. He was checking fence on the high ridge when his horse spooked at a rattlesnake and threw him. He landed wrong the way men always land wrong and lay in the grass with the sky wheeling above him until Beckett found him 4 hours later, following the riderless horse back to its starting point. Emmett was still alive when Beckett reached him. Barely. His breath came in shallow hitches and his eyes were glassy with pain, and he gripped Beckett's hand with a strength that seemed borrowed from somewhere beyond his broken body. "The letters," Emmett whispered. "She's coming." "Don't talk. I'll get help." "No time." Emmett's fingers tightened. "Beck, promise me. Anything. If I'm gone before she gets here, look after her. She's got nobody, Beck. Nobody in the whole world. Don't let her come all this way to find nothing. You're not going to die." But Emmett's eyes said otherwise. They were already looking at something Beckett could not see, something beyond the ridge and the sky and the grass waving in the wind. "She's a good woman," Emmett said. "Better than I deserved. Better than a 3-line advertisement in a newspaper." He almost smiled. "You made me sound like a poet, Beck." "Emmett, tell her. Tell her the voice she loved in those letters. It belongs to a good man." Beckett's throat closed. "Emmett, don't. Promise me." "I promise." Emmett Thornton died with his hand in his friend's hand, in the Wyoming sky above him, and the last letter from Theda Whitfield folded in his breast pocket, unread, because she had written it after he had already fallen, and the mail was slow, and time does not wait for the living or the dead. They buried him under the cottonwood by the creek. Reverend Aldous Crane read the words. Beckett stood with Wren on his hip and watched the dirt cover his friend and knew that the promise he had made was already strangling him. After the funeral, he sat at his kitchen table and wrote 2 letters. The first was to Theda Whitfield, care of the boarding house in Harrisburg. He told her plainly, without the poetry he had given Emmett's name, that Emmett Thornton was dead, that he was sorry, that she should not come. He gave the letter to Crane, who carried it to the post office in town. The letter never arrived. Thea had already sold her last belongings, given notice at the boarding house, and boarded a westbound train. The letter sat in a dead letter bin at the Harrisburg post office until a clerk threw it away in September. Beckett wrote a second letter addressed to General Delivery in Copper Creek, hoping she would inquire at the post office when she arrived. That letter arrived and waited. But Thea rode into town on a Sunday, asked directions to the Thornton Ranch at the saloon, and left before the post office opened Monday morning. She never knew it existed. She arrived at the ranch in late July, dusty and exhausted and full of a nervous hope that made her stomach flutter and her hands shake. She had imagined this moment for months, stepping down from the horse she had hired in town, smoothing her dress, touching her hair. She had pictured a man coming out of the barn, tall, uncertain, smiling, the way you smile when the thing you hope for actually appears. Instead, she found the grave. Fresh earth beneath the cottonwood, a wooden cross with his name carved in uneven letters. Emmett Thornton, born 1845, died 1883. Rest in the Lord. Thea stood before the cross for a very long time. The afternoon light came through the cottonwood leaves and made moving patterns on the dark earth. A meadowlark sang somewhere in the grass. She had traveled 1,400 miles to meet a man who wrote her letters so beautiful they made her cry on a rented bed in Pennsylvania, and he was here under the ground, and the letters were all she had left of him. She did not cry. Not then. She would cry later alone in the cabin that smelled of a stranger's life, surrounded by his things, his books, his boots, by the door, the dent in his pillow where his head had rested for the last time. But at the grave, she was silent. She had used up her allotment of tears for the year on her mother. She had none left for a man she had never met. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. A man was coming around the side of the barn, moving with the hesitant gait of someone who has been watching and waiting and has decided finally that waiting is worse than whatever comes next. Beckett stopped 10 feet from her. He held his hat in his hands. Behind him, barely visible in the barn doorway, a small dark-haired child peered out from behind a post. "You're Miss Whitfield," he said. "Who are you, Cowboy?" "Beckett Baldwin. I was Emmett's neighbor, his friend." "He's dead." "Yes, ma'am. 3 weeks now. I wrote to tell you, but..." I didn't receive any letter. No, ma'am. I expect you didn't. They stood there in the late July heat, the grave between them. The child watching from the barn, the meadowlark still singing as if nothing had happened, as if men did not die and women did not travel across continents for love and arrive to find it already in the ground. I have nowhere to go, Thea said. She said it flatly without appeal, the way you state a mathematical truth. The sum of her life, no family, no money, no home, no return ticket. The equation balanced at zero. Emmett's cabin is yours, Beckett said. He would have wanted that. Everything he had, he meant for you. You knew about me, about the letters. The question hung in the air. Beckett's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He talked about you, Beckett said carefully. He was looking forward to meeting you. It was true. It was also the beginning of a silence that would grow larger with each passing week, filling the spaces between them. Like water filling a crack in stone, invisible until the day it froze and split everything apart. The present. Late October. 3 months had passed since that meeting at the grave. 3 months of Beckett riding over each morning to help with the ranch, bringing Ren staying until evening. 3 months of work and meals and quiet evenings and the slow, careful construction of something that looked very much like a family, but that nobody dared call by that name. And now Thea stood at the mailbox at the end of the dirt road holding a letter that threatened to unmake it all. The envelope was heavy cream colored with a return address in St. Louis and the name of a law firm embossed in the corner. It was addressed to the current occupant of the Thornton property or any party in unlawful possession thereof. She opened it with fingers that had gone cold despite the afternoon sun. The letter was from Harriet Thornton Pierce, sister of the deceased, legal heir. She was claiming the ranch, the land, the cattle, everything Emmett had owned, and everything Thea had been living in as though it were hers. The language was formal, precise, devastating. Thea Whitfield had no legal standing. She was not Emmett's wife. She was not his kin. She was, in the eyes of the law, a stranger occupying property to which she had no claim. Thea folded the letter and put it in her pocket. She walked back to the cabin, slowly watching the light change on the mountains the way Beckett had described it in a letter that she believed had been written by a dead man. The stone turning from gray to amber to a deep, impossible rose. On the porch, Wren was drawing in her book. Inside, Beckett was mending a harness. The smell of coffee and wood smoke drifted through the open door. Thea stopped in the yard. She looked at the cabin, at the child, at the shadow of the man moving behind the window. She thought about 14 letters tied with a blue ribbon. She thought about a voice she had loved before she ever heard it spoken aloud. And she thought for the first time since arriving in Wyoming, what right do I have to any of this? What right do I have to these people, this place, this life that was built on letters written by a man who is dead? Letters that spoke in a voice I hear every day from a man who is alive. The wind picked up scattering leaves across the yard. Winter was coming, and with it, the truth. She climbed the porch steps, touched Wren's hair as she passed, and went inside to start supper. She did not mention the letter, not that night, not yet. But she placed it in her carpet bag beneath the bundle of 14 letters, and she lay awake long after the fire burned low, listening to the wind and the silence and the sound of her own certainty crumbling slowly like a riverbank giving way to the current. She kept the letter for 3 days before it began to change her. Not all at once. The shift was gradual, like the way frost works on stone, finding the smallest fissures, filling them with ice, expanding in silence until the damage is done. On the surface, the days continued as before. Coffee at dawn, chores through the morning lunch under the cottonwood, if the weather held. Wren trailing behind her like a small shadow, learning the rhythms of a household run by a woman who was learning them herself. Beckett arriving before sunrise, working until his hands ached, speaking only when speech was necessary, and sometimes not even then. But Thea had begun to ask questions. Not the gentle, wondering kind she had asked before, the soft inquiries about Emmett's habits and preferences, the widow's archaeology of a man she'd never met. These new questions had edges. They came at unexpected moments, dropped into conversation like stones into still water, and she watched the ripples with a teacher's sharp eye. Did Emmett read much? She asked one morning, handing Beckett his coffee. A simple question, but she watched his face as she asked it, watched the way his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the cup. Some, Beckett said, not as much as some folks. The books on his shelf. Were they his, mostly? A few might have been gifts. There's a copy of Emerson in there, Thoreau too. Marginalia in a very neat hand. She sipped her coffee. Emmett had neat handwriting. A pause, the kind of pause that fills a room. Couldn't say, Beckett replied. I didn't pay much attention to his penmanship. He went outside after that, and Thea stood at the window holding her cup and watching him cross the yard with the long, steady stride of a man who was not hurrying, because hurrying would be an admission that something was wrong. She did not yet know what she was looking for. The letter from Harriet had planted a seed of doubt, not about the land or the legal claim, but about something subtler, something that lived in the space between the Emmett she knew from his letters and the Emmett the town remembered. The school teacher in her had noticed the discrepancy months ago, but had filed it away in the forgiving category of people are different on paper. Now, with a lawyer's letter in her carpet bag and a winter coming that might strip her of everything, she found herself returning to that discrepancy with a less forgiving eye. On the fourth day after the letter, Beckett offered to teach her to ride properly. She could sit a horse well enough, had managed the 2-mile trip from town to the ranch on a hired mare without disgracing herself, and had since learned to saddle and bridle with reasonable competence. But there was a difference between riding and riding, between using a horse as transportation and moving with it as a partner, and Beckett had noticed her struggling with the more spirited animals. The bay mare's got a soft mouth, he said, leading the horse into the yard. She'll respond to your seat more than your hands. You need to think of your hips as a conversation. Thea felt heat rise in her cheeks at the word hips and was furious with herself for it. She was 31 years old, not a schoolgirl. They worked in the corral for an hour, Beckett on foot, directing her through turns and transitions. Wren sat on the top rail of the fence, watching with the grave attention of a judge evaluating evidence. The child's drawing book was closed on her lap, her pencil still. She watched her father's hands as he adjusted the reins in Thea's grip, watched the way he stood close to the horse's shoulder when Thea practiced. Stops and starts, watched everything with those wide gray eyes that missed nothing and revealed less. Relax your lower back, Beckett said, and placed his hand on Thea's waist to demonstrate the angle. Just his fingertips, 5 points of pressure through the fabric of her riding dress. They both went still. The mare shifted beneath her, sensing the change in its rider's body, the sudden absence of breath, the locked muscles. Thea felt the warmth of his hand through the cloth, and for one unguarded moment, she leaned into it the way a cold person leans toward a fire, instinctive, involuntary. Beckett pulled his hand back as if the fabric had burned him. He stepped away and, adjusting his hat, his jaw set in the way it always set when he was fighting something inside himself. You've got the idea, he said, his voice flattened to neutral. Practice at a walk first. We'll try trotting tomorrow. He went to the barn. The lesson was over. On the fence rail, Wren opened her drawing book and began to sketch. 2 figures standing close together, one touching the other. She drew quickly, then closed the book before anyone could see. The rider appeared on the road 5 days later, and Thea knew before the distance resolved into detail that this was not a neighbor, not a drifter, not anyone who belonged to this landscape. The horse was too fine, the posture too upright, the traveling dress too dark and too pressed for anyone who had spent more than an hour on these roads. The woman dismounted at the gate with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to ride in a different country, a country of paved streets and livery stables. She was tall, sharp-featured, with iron gray hair pulled back in a style that had been fashionable in St. Louis 2 seasons ago. Her eyes, when they met Thea's across the yard, were the same pale blue as Emmett's in the photograph above the mantel. Miss Whitfield, the woman said. Not a question. Mrs. Pierce. Mrs. Thornton Pierce, I kept my brother's name. She looked past Thea at the cabin, the barn, the land stretching away to the mountains. Her expression was unreadable, but her gloved hands gripped the reins with a pressure that turned her knuckles white beneath the leather. I didn't expect you in person, Thea said. Your lawyer's letter suggested correspondence would be sufficient. Letters can be ignored. I am harder to ignore. This was true. Harriet Thornton Pierce had the quality of certain natural forces of permanence that made everything around her feel temporary. Thea invited her in. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Emmett had once struggled to write his own name, where Beckett had transformed that struggle into something beautiful, where Thea ate her meals each day, surrounded by the ghost of a man she was beginning to suspect she had never truly known. Harriet looked around the cabin the way a woman looks at her childhood bedroom after decades away. She touched the spine of a book on the shelf, ran her finger along the edge of the mantel, paused at the photograph of Emmett. "He was 43 pounds when he was born," she said. "Biggest baby in the county. Our mother never let him forget it." She said this to the photograph, not to Thea. Then she turned. "You're living in my brother's house. Your brother invited me here." "My brother invited a wife. You are not his wife. You are a woman with some letters and a train ticket." Thea felt the words land like slaps, precise and stinging. Not because they were cruel though they were, but because they were true. She had no legal standing, no marriage certificate, no deed, no will naming her as beneficiary. She was a woman sitting in a dead man's chair. "Emmett chose me," Thea said. "He wrote to me for 5 months. He asked me to come." Harriet's expression flickered. Something moved behind the ice, some recognition of pain that she was choosing for now not to acknowledge. "My brother was a good man," Harriet said. "Simple, honest, hard-working. He built this ranch from nothing with his own 2 hands. And when he died, he had no wife, no children, no will. Under territorial law, his estate passes to his nearest living relative." She paused. "That's me. And you've come to take it. I've come to understanding what happened to my brother's property and to determine whether a stranger should be living in it." The word stranger cut deepest, because that is exactly what Thea was. The kitchen door opened, and Beckett came in, stamping dust from his boots. He stopped when he saw Harriet. Recognition passed between them, the wary kind, 2 people who knew of each other but had never stood in the same room. "Mrs. Pierce," he said, removing his hat. "Mr. Calloway, Emmett mentioned you in his letters to me." Harriet's eyes narrowed, examining him with an intensity that went beyond casual appraisal. She looked at him the way a person looks at a word they have seen misspelled, knowing something is wrong, but not yet certain what. "My condolences," Beckett said. "Emmett was the finest man I knew." "Yes, he was." Harriet held his gaze a moment longer than necessary, then turned back to Thea. "I'll be staying in town. We have matters to discuss, you and I. Legal matters. I suggest you find representation." She left the way she had arrived, upright and certain, a woman armored in grief and property law. Thea watched her ride away and realized her hands were shaking. Beckett poured her coffee without being asked. "How long has she been here?" "Long enough to make her position clear, which is that I'm nobody, a stranger with some letters." She did not mean to echo Harriet's words so exactly, but they had lodged in her like splinters, and now they worked their way to the surface. Beckett set the cup in front of her, and his hand brushed hers, and this time neither of them pulled away. "You're not nobody," he said quietly. "Not to this ranch, not to Wren." He did not say not to me, but the shape of those words hung in the air between them, visible as breath on a cold morning. From the doorway, Wren appeared holding a wooden box. She carried it to the table and set it down with both hands, looking up at Thea with those bottomless gray eyes. Thea recognized the box. It had been among Emmett's things stored in the small room off the kitchen. She had never opened it. "Wren brought this," Thea said, looking at Beckett. "Do you know what's in it?" "Emmett's personals. The town held them after he passed. Harriet must have claimed them on her way through." Thea lifted the lid. Inside, a folding knife with a bone handle, a pocket watch with a cracked crystal, a leather pouch of tobacco gone dry and stale, and a bundle of papers tied with kitchen string. She untied the bundle and spread the pages on the table. Her breath stopped. The first page was covered in Emmett's handwriting, large, and labored, each letter formed with the painful effort of a man wrestling a language that did not come naturally. "Dear Miss Whitfeld, your letter was real nice. I have cattle and..." The sentence stopped. A heavy line of ink crossed it out. Beneath that, on the same page in a different hand entirely, the same thought appeared transformed. The handwriting was smaller, fluid, confident, the handwriting of someone who thought in sentences and wrote the way water runs downhill, naturally, without obstruction. The words were the opening of the first letter Thea had received. She recognized them the way you recognize your own face in a photograph, immediately, viscerally. 2 handwritings, 1 page. The rough draft and the finished version side by side. Thea stared at the page. Then she looked at Beckett, then at the page again. She did not speak. Beckett watched her from across the table, and she saw it happen the moment he realized what she was holding, the blood draining from his face in a slow tide, leaving his skin the color of old paper. He opened his mouth. "Don't," Thea said. She gathered the papers, placed them back in the box, and closed the lid. "Not now." She took the box into the bedroom and shut the door. Beckett stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the silence that came after a silence that was different from all the silences before it, heavier, colder final. Wren looked up at her father. She did not speak, but she reached out and took his hand. Harriet Thornton Pierce sat in the room she had rented above the general store in Copper Creek and read by lamplight. She had her own bundle of letters, the ones Emmett had sent her over the years, infrequent, brief, written in the blunt, misspelled prose of a man for whom writing was manual labor. She had also taken the draft pages from the box before delivering it to the ranch. Not all of them, just one. A single sheet with Emmett's abandoned attempts on one side and the flowing finished version on the other. She held it up to the lamp. She compared the handwriting to her brother's letters to her. The rough scrawl on the draft pages matched. The elegant hand did not. She thought about the man at the ranch, Beckett Calloway, his careful speech, his quiet authority, the way Emmett's letters to her had sometimes mentioned Beck, with the easy affection of a man talking about his right hand. She understood now. Not everything, not yet, but enough. Enough to know that the letters which had brought Theda Whitfield across a continent had not been written by her brother. Enough to know that the woman living in Emmett's house had fallen in love with a voice that did not belong to the man she thought she was marrying. Harriet folded the paper and placed it in her traveling case. She was not a cruel woman, though the frontier and widowhood had stripped her of the luxury of softness. She had buried a husband in St. Louis 3 years ago, had spent those years dismantling his debts and rebuilding her independence piece by piece. She understood loss. She understood the particular cruelty of discovering that the person you loved was not entirely the person you thought. She did not yet know what she would do with this knowledge, but she had it. And in a country where land and law were the only currencies that mattered, knowledge was worth more than both. 2 days of silence. Thea did not confront Beckett. She did not open the box again. She went about her work with a mechanical precision that Beckett recognized as the outward face of an inner catastrophe, the way a person moves when they are holding themselves together by will alone, and know that stopping even for a moment will bring the whole structure down. He came each morning. He worked. He did not speak unless spoken to, and Thea did not speak. The only sounds were the tools and the animals and the wind, and Wren's pencil moving across paper drawing pictures that nobody asked to see. On the second evening, Thea made dinner for 4. She set a place for Harriet, who had sent word through the general store owner that she would come to discuss terms. The table looked strange, with its 4 settings wrong, in the way that a word looks wrong when you stare at it too long. Harriet arrived at 6. She was civil, almost warm, as if the legal threat she carried had been set aside for the evening, like a coat hung by the door. She complimented the stew. She asked about the ranch, about the cattle, about preparations for winter. She spoke to Beckett with a careful neutrality that carried beneath its surface the weight of what she now knew. And then Wren did something none of them expected. The child had been sitting in her usual spot, eating quietly her doll on the chair beside her. When Harriet's water glass emptied, Wren slid off her chair, went to the counter, filled a cup from the pitcher, and carried it back to the table with both hands. She set it in front of Harriet with the solemnity of a sacrament. Harriet looked at the cup. She looked at the child. Her mouth opened, then closed. Her eyes, which had been dry and sharp all evening, went suddenly terribly bright. "Thank you," she whispered. Wren nodded once, climbed back into her chair, and resumed eating as if she had done nothing remarkable. But something in the room had shifted. Harriet's hand trembled on the table. She picked up the cup and drank, and the water might as well have been wine for the way it broke her. After dinner, Thea told Wren a bedtime story while Harriet sat in Emmett's chair by the fire and Beckett cleaned the kitchen. The story was about a teacher who traveled to a strange land where nobody spoke the same language, and she had to learn to listen with her eyes instead of her ears. Wren lay on the feather mattress watching Thea's face in the lamplight, and her hand crept out from under the quilt to rest on Thea's wrist, a touch so light it was almost imagined. In the main room, Harriet held one of Emmett's books and turned the pages without reading them. Tears moved down her face in silence, the controlled grief of a woman who had learned long ago that crying was a private act. In the kitchen, Beckett dried the last dish and stared at the wall. 4 people in one small house, each of them alone in a different way, each of them closer to the others than they could afford to admit. The confrontation came the next morning when Thea rode out to check the north pasture, and Harriet found Beckett alone in the barn. She did not waste time. "I have something to show you." She placed the draft page on a hay bale between them, the 2 handwritings side by side, Emmett's crude attempts, the polished version beneath. "This is not my brother's writing," Harriet said. "This is yours." Beckett looked at the page. He did not deny it. "He couldn't write well," Beckett said. "He asked me to help." "Help, is that what you call it? These aren't his words, Mr. Calloway. These are yours. The feelings, the observations, the poetry of it. My brother could barely spell his own name. He could not have written a single sentence of what this woman received. He told me what he wanted to say. I found better words for it. You found your words for it. There's a difference." Harriet picked up the page. "Does she know silence?" "I see." Harriet's voice was quiet but carried the precision of a scalpel. "You let her fall in love with your voice wearing my brother's name. And then when he died, you stayed. You came to this ranch every day, worked beside her, let her hear the same voice from your mouth that she had loved on paper, and you said nothing. Emmett asked me to look after her. Emmett asked you to look after her, not to court her by omission." The word court landed like a blow. Beckett's jaw tightened. "I wasn't courting." "No, then what would you call it? Coming here every morning, eating at her table, teaching her to ride, watching your daughter learn to love her." Harriet stepped closer. "You love her, Mr. Calloway. Don't insult us both by pretending otherwise." He said nothing. There was nothing to say. The truth stood between them like a third person in the room, solid and undeniable. "What are you going to do?" he asked finally. "I don't know yet. But I think she deserves to know who wrote those letters." "Don't you?" Harriet left the barn. Beckett stood alone in the half-dark, surrounded by the smell of hay and horse, and pressed his forehead against the rough wood of a stall door and breathed. But Harriet was not the one who broke it open. The truth found its own way out, the way water finds cracks in a dam. That evening, Thea sat at the kitchen table with the box open before her. She had been avoiding it for 2 days, circling it the way you circle a wound, knowing that looking at it will make it real. But the not knowing had become worse than the knowing, and so she spread the pages out one by one and studied them with the methodical attention of a woman who had spent her life teaching penmanship. Emmett's writing was unmistakable. Large, stiff, the letters formed with effort and abandoned mid-thought. She could see the man in those clumsy marks, the broad hands more comfortable with reins than with a pen. The honest frustration of someone who felt things deeply but could not make the words lie down on paper the way they sounded in his head. The other handwriting was equally unmistakable. She had seen it every day for 3 months without recognizing it. On the ranch calendar in the kitchen where someone had noted dates for worming and fence checks. On the feed inventory tacked to the barn wall. On the small labels tied to the harness pegs. Beckett's handwriting, neat, slanted slightly, left the letters connected in a fluid chain that moved across the page like a river finding its course. She took the letters from her carpet bag, all 14. She untied the blue ribbon and spread them on the table beside the drafts. The same hand, every letter. Every word she had loved, every phrase she had memorized, every sentence that had made her feel for the first time in years that someone in the world understood the precise shape of her loneliness. All of it written by Beckett Calloway. She heard his boots on the porch. The door opened. He saw the letters on the table and stopped. The color left his face the way light leaves a room when a lamp is blown out all at once completely. "Sit down," Thea said. He sat. "Your handwriting." She touched the draft page, then the letter beside it. "These are the same hand." "Yes. From the beginning, from the third letter." "The third letter." She repeated it slowly, tasting the mathematics of it. "I received 14 letters. 12 of them were yours. Emmett told me what he wanted to say. I just don't." Her voice was quiet, but it stopped him as effectively as a shout. "Don't tell me you just anything. You wrote 12 letters to a woman who thought she was falling in love with someone else. You wrote about loneliness and beauty and the sound of the creek at night, and none of it was his. It was yours. Thea, when I arrived and found the grave, you were there, waiting for me. You knew who I was before I said a word because you had been writing to me for 5 months." She pressed her palms flat against the table, steadying herself. And for 3 months after that, you came to this house every day and listened to me quote your own words back to you as if they belonged to a dead man. You let me grieve a poet who couldn't spell. He was a good man. I know he was a good man. That's not the point. What is the point? The point is that I traveled 1,400 miles to marry a voice, and the voice was yours, and you knew it, and you said nothing. Beckett looked at the letter spread across the table, the pages soft and worn from her handling. The ink faded where her fingers had traced the words over and over. I tried to tell you he was dead, he said. I wrote 2 letters. They never reached you. But you didn't try to tell me the truth about who wrote them. That's a different silence, Beckett, a longer one. He had no answer for that. There was no answer for that. Thea gathered the letters carefully one by one and stacked them in order. Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady. Everything about her was steady except the thing inside her chest that was coming apart. I need you to leave, she said. Thea, please. I'm not asking. He stood. He called for Wren. The child appeared in the doorway of the small room, her drawing book clutched to her chest, her eyes enormous in her thin face. She looked at Thea. She looked at her father. She understood nothing and everything at once, the way children do reading, the weather of adult grief with an accuracy that no words could improve. Beckett knelt beside his daughter. We need to go home, sunshine. Wren shook her head. We need to go home now. The child looked at Thea one more time, a look that held everything she could not say. Please stay, don't make us leave. I just learned to be happy here. Then she took her father's hand and followed him to the door. On the threshold, Beckett turned. I'm sorry, he said, for all of it, for the letters, for the silence, for not being the man you thought you were writing to. That's the thing, Thea said, and her voice cracked for the first time. You were exactly the man I was writing to. That's what makes it unforgivable. The door closed behind them. Thea listened to their footsteps crossing the porch, descending the stairs, crunching across the frozen yard. She heard the barn door open and close. She heard the horse being saddled, the creak of leather, the soft sound of a man lifting a child into the saddle, then hoofbeats growing fainter, then nothing. She looked at the chair where Wren always sat. The cloth doll was there, the one with the button eyes and the lopsided smile, the one Lorna had sewn for her daughter's 4th birthday. Wren had left it behind, whether by accident or design, Thea could not tell. She picked up the doll. It smelled of child of hay, of the lavender sachet Thea kept in the linen cupboard. She held it against her chest the way she held the letters, pressing it close as if proximity could substitute for presence. And then she cried. Not for Emmett, whom she had never met. Not for the deception which she could catalog and analyze and eventually perhaps understand. She cried for the thing that she had been building without knowing it, the careful architecture of belonging, the daily accumulation of shared meals and mended fences and quiet evenings and a child's hand on her wrist in the dark. She cried for the family she had assembled from the wreckage of other people's losses, the family that had felt for a few bright weeks as solid and real as the cabin walls around her. She cried because she had told Beckett the truest thing she knew. He was exactly the man she had been writing to, and she had sent him away. Outside, the sky darkened, the temperature dropped, and the second storm of the season, the real one, the one that would teach them all what winter actually meant, began to build behind the mountains like a held breath. By morning, the world would be white and silent and merciless. And somewhere in that whiteness, a 7-year-old girl who had not spoken in 8 months would be alone in the cold, and 2 people who could not forgive each other would have to find a way to save her. But that was morning. Tonight there was only the doll and the letters and the sound of wind rising. Part 2 đã được viết hoàn chỉnh ở phần hồi trước. Tôi hiểu bạn muốn tiếp tục sang part 3 phần cuối cùng. Tôi viết ngay. Part 3, home, the storm broke before dawn. Thea woke to a silence so absolute it had weight. No wind, no creak of settling timber. No cattle calling from the pasture. Just the white nothing of a world buried under snow. She went to the window and scraped frost from the glass with her thumbnail. Outside, the yard had vanished. The fence posts were stumps. The barn was a gray shape, half swallowed by drifts that reached the eaves. The cottonwood by the creek, the one that shaded Emmett's grave, stood black and skeletal against the sky the color of milk. She dressed in the cold, her fingers clumsy on the buttons, and built up the fire. The cabin was quiet in a way it had not been quiet before. The small sounds she had grown accustomed to were gone. The rustle of a child turning in sleep, a soft thump of a cloth doll falling from a bed, the almost silence of someone breathing in the next room. All gone, replaced by the hard silence of a house with only one person in it. She set the coffee to boil and ate a biscuit, standing at the counter, looking at the kitchen calendar on the wall. Beckett's handwriting marked the days: worming schedule, hay delivery, fence check, north pasture. Each entry in the same neat left-leaning hand that had written 14 letters to a woman in Pennsylvania, each small notation a piece of evidence she had looked at every morning without seeing. The coffee tasted like nothing. She went to the barn to feed the animals. The work was harder alone. The water trough had frozen solid and had to be broken with an axe. The horses stamped and blew in their stalls, unsettled by the cold. One of the barn cats wound between her ankles, mewing, and she picked it up and held it against her coat for a moment, feeling its purr vibrate against her breastbone. When she returned to the cabin, she found herself standing in the doorway of the small room where Beckett and Wren had slept. The bedrolls were gone. The nail where Wren had hung her coat was empty. The only trace of them was a faint indentation in the mattress where a small body had curled each night, and tucked behind the door, a single sheet of paper that had slipped from Wren's drawing book. Thea picked it up. The drawing was different from the others. No figure standing before a house. Instead, Wren had drawn just the house itself, small and square with smoke curling from the chimney, and a window where a lamp burned yellow. Around the house, nothing. No trees, no fence, no people. Just the house and the vast white emptiness of a blank page pressing in from every side. And at the bottom, in letters so shaky they were barely legible, written by a hand that had watched a teacher form words for 3 months and was trying for the first time to make words of its own, a single word: home. Thea sat on the edge of the mattress and held the paper and breathed. The child who had not spoken in 8 months, who had retreated so far into silence that her own father could not reach her, had written a word. Not spoken it, written it. Because she had watched Thea write every day, watched her fingers move across pages, watched the way letters became words, became meaning. And she had understood in whatever deep place children understand things that language was a door. And she had been standing on the other side of it, and she wanted to come through. And the word she had chosen was home. Thea folded the paper carefully and placed it in her pocket next to the letter from Harriet's lawyer. 2 documents, one demanding she leave, one asking her to stay. She went to the mantel and picked up Lorna's doll from where she had set it the night before. The button eyes stared up at her with their permanent, stitched-on surprise. "What do I do?" she asked the doll. The doll did not answer. Dolls never do. But holding it made her think of the hands that had sewn it, a mother's hands working by lamplight, to make something soft for a daughter to hold when the world got hard. And she thought of Wren's hands, small and careful, carrying water to a stranger at a dinner table. And she thought of Beckett's hands, calloused and tentative, resting for one moment on her waist before pulling away as if from a flame. She set the doll down and put on her coat. The animal still needed tending. The fence would need checking after the storm. The cattle in the near pasture would need hay brought out. There was enough work for 3 people, and she was one, and winter did not care about broken hearts or broken trust, and the land would not wait while she decided what she felt. Harriet came to the ranch on the 3rd day after the storm. She came on foot, having left her horse at the livery in town, wrapped in a coat too thin for the weather, and carrying a leather satchel that contained, Thea assumed, the documents that would end her time on this land. The walk from town was 4 miles through knee-deep snow, and by the time Harriet reached the porch, her cheeks were raw, and her breathing labored, and her eyes held the particular fury of a woman who has done something difficult and will not acknowledge the difficulty. Thea brought her inside without a word, set coffee on the table, waited. But Harriet did not produce documents. Instead, she opened the satchel and removed the bundle of letters, the ones Emmett had sent her over the years. His real letters, short, misspelled, blunt as a hammer. She placed them on the table. Then she placed beside them the 14 letters Thea had received, the ones written in Beckett's hand under Emmett's name. "I read them all," Harriet said. "Both sets. His to me and his to you." Wait, she paused. "Except they weren't his to you, were they?" Thea said nothing. "My brother wrote to me once or twice a year. Short letters, weather and cattle prices, mostly. Once he told me about a coyote that got into the hen house. That was the longest letter I ever received from him. 11 sentences. Harriet touched the stack of 14. These letters have more words in a single page than Emmett wrote me in a decade. These are not my brother's letters. No, Thea said. They're not. You know who wrote them? Yes. The neighbor, Calloway. Thea nodded. Harriet was quiet for a time. She held her coffee cup the way Beckett held his, Thea noticed, with both hands curving her fingers around the warmth. A frontier habit, a human habit. The habit of people who have been cold often enough to never take warmth for granted. My husband died 3 years ago, Harriet said. Charles, he was a banker. Very respectable, very correct. He wrote beautiful letters when we were courting. After we married, I found out he had hired a clerk to write them. She looked at Thea over the rim of her cup. I stayed married to him for 22 years. He was not the man his letters promised, but he was the man who wanted to be that man. I decided that was enough. Was it? Some days. Other days, I hated him for making me love a fiction. She set the cup down. The difference is Charles hired a stranger. Emmett asked his closest friend, a man who was grieving his own wife, a man who put his own loneliness into those words because he had nowhere else to put it. She paused. That changes the equation, I think. It doesn't change the lie. No, but it changes what the lie was made of. They sat in the silence that follows when two women have said true things to each other and neither has flinched. Outside, the snow was beginning to melt in patches, where the noon sun hit the ground, dark earth showing through like wounds in the white skin. I've been reading these letters for 3 days, Harriet said. All of them. And I keep coming back to one thing. My brother couldn't write these words. He couldn't even think them, not in this shape, not with this beauty. But he read them, everyone. He approved them. He signed his name to them. She picked up a letter, held it to the light. There's a passage in the 7th letter about how the land doesn't forgive carelessness, but rewards patience. Emmett could have said that. Those are his values, even if they're not his words. That doesn't make it honest. No, but maybe it makes it something else. Maybe it makes it the only kind of love letter Emmett knew how to send. He couldn't write his own heart, so he found someone who could write it for him. Someone whose heart happened to sound like his because they loved the same land and lived under the same sky and were both losing the women they loved at the same time. Thea felt something shift inside her, not forgiveness, not yet, but the first hairline crack in the wall she had built. Harriet reached into her satchel again and produced a pocket watch. It was old and the case dented, the crystal cracked in a starburst pattern that caught the light. She placed it on the table between them. This was Emmett's, our father's before that. It's the only thing I came here to take. She closed the satchel. I'm withdrawing my claim to the property. Thea stared. Why? Because my brother wanted you here. However the words reached you, however the invitation was worded, he chose you. He read those letters and said, yes, send this, tell her, this is who I am. And in his way it was. Harriet stood. I lost a husband who pretended to be someone he wasn't. I won't take away the home of a woman who was loved by a man who couldn't pretend, so he asked someone to speak for him. There's a difference, Tanamo. She put on her coat. At the door she turned. Keep the watch, she said. I want you to have something of his that's real, something with no words attached. Thea picked up the watch. The weight of it surprised her, solid and cool in her palm. She pressed the catch and the case opened. Inside, scratched into the metal with a knife point in Emmett's unmistakable rough hand, 2 words for her. He had carved them himself. No help needed, no poet required. He knew she was coming, Harriet said quietly. He prepared, in his own way. She left. Thea sat at the table with the watch in her hand and the letters spread before her and cried for Emmett Thornton for the first time. Not for the man in the letters, for the man behind them. The man who could not say what he felt, but who carved 2 words into his father's watch with a pocket knife, because some truths do not need beautiful language, only a steady hand and a sharp blade. A week passed. The snow retreated slowly, grudgingly, as if winter were testing the valley's resolve before committing to the siege. Thea worked the ranch alone. She discovered muscles she didn't know she had and limits she hadn't known she could push past. She broke ice-hauled hay, repaired a section of fence that the storm had flattened, and fell into bed each night with her body aching and her mind turning over the same thoughts like stones in a tumbler, wearing them smoother, but never quite smooth enough. She missed them. That was the simple truth beneath all the analysis and anger and justified hurt. She missed the sound of Beckett's boots on the porch at dawn. She missed the weight of Wren leaning against her side. She missed the feeling of being necessary to someone, of mattering in the daily unglamorous way that a person matters when someone else is counting on them for breakfast. She took out Wren's drawing and looked at it every evening. Home. The letters wobbling like a foal finding its legs. She propped it on the shelf beside the pocket watch and the photograph of Emmett, and the three objects sat together like pieces of a story waiting to be assembled in the right order. On the seventh day, Reverend Aldous Crane appeared. He came on a mule, which was the only animal sensible enough to navigate the roads in this weather. He was a tall man, thin as a rail, with a face like a weathered fence post, and eyes that held the particular gentleness of someone who has heard every kind of confession and been surprised by none of them. "Miss Whitfield," he said, dismounting, with the careful stiffness of a man whose joints had opinions about cold weather. "Thought I might pay a visit. Reverend, coffee, if it's not too much trouble." They sat at the kitchen table, the stove ticking with heat. Crane looked around the cabin with the practiced eye of a man who could read a household the way some men read trails, noting what was present and what was absent, constructing a story from the evidence. "Heard young Calloway and his girl moved back to his place," Crane said, wrapping his hands around the cup. "They did. Heard it wasn't entirely by choice." "It was entirely by my choice, Reverend." Crane nodded slowly. He sipped his coffee and seemed to make a decision. "I'm going to tell you something," he said. "I promised a man I'd tell it at the right time, and I believe this is the right time, though. I've been wrong about timing before. Ask my wife. She'll give you a list." Thea waited. "Emmett Thornton and I were friends," Crane said. "Not church friends, real friends. The kind that tell each other things they wouldn't tell God. Though I've always maintained God hears it all anyway and doesn't judge as harshly as people fear." He set down his cup. "A week before he died, Emmett came to see me. Not for confession, not for counsel. He came to ask me a favor." "What kind of favor?" "The kind a man asks when he suspects his luck is running short." Emmett was practical about death. Ranchers usually are. He told me about the letters about Miss Whitfield coming from Pennsylvania, about how Beck had been writing on his behalf. Crane paused. "And he told me something else. He said, 'Aldous, I'm not a fool. I know Beck's putting himself into those letters. I've watched him write them. He reads her replies and his face changes. He's falling for her and she's falling for whoever's holding the pen, and that turns out to be him." Thea's hands went still on the table. "I asked Emmett if he was angry," Crane continued. "He said no. He said Beck lost Lorna 4 months ago. He's drowning. Writing those letters is the only thing keeping his head above water. And if some of what he writes comes from his own heart instead of mine, well, his heart and mine want the same thing. We both want her to come. We both want her to be happy here." The fire crackled. A log shifted, sending up a brief fountain of sparks. "Then Emmett asked me the favor," Crane said. He said, "If something happens to me before she arrives, don't tell her right away about who wrote the letters. Let her settle in. Let her see the land. Let her find her own reasons to stay before you give her a reason to doubt." And I said, "Emmett, that's not entirely honest." And he said, "Aldous, sir, I placed an advertisement for a wife in a newspaper. Honesty left the barn a long time ago." Despite everything, Thea almost smiled. "But there was more," Crane said, and his voice dropped to something softer, something with weight. "The last thing," he said, "the thing he asked me to tell. He said, if she comes and if I'm gone and if someday she finds out about Beck and the letters tell her this, tell her the voice she loved in those letters belongs to a good man. Better than me at words, but not better than me at meaning. We wrote those letters together, him and me. He put in the poetry, I put in the wanting. And if I'm not there to love her myself, then he should love her for both of us. Because I'd rather she be loved by my best friend than alone on my land." Crane stopped. He picked up his coffee, found it had gone cold, and drank it anyway. Thea sat motionless. The words moved through her like water, through cracked ground, finding every dry place, filling every hollow. Emmett had known, not suspected, not ignored, but known. He had understood what was happening in those letters, the way two men's hearts had merged on the page, and he had not been threatened or betrayed. He had been grateful. Grateful that his friend's grief had found an outlet. Grateful that the woman coming to marry him would arrive already knowing the sound of someone who would take care of her if he could not. He knew, she whispered. He knew, and he gave his blessing. In his own voice, in his own words, rough as they were. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Crane considered this. Because Emmett told me to wait until you needed to hear it, not until you wanted to hear it. Last week you wanted to hear it. You wanted someone to make the hurt make sense. But wanting isn't the same as needing. He looked at her steadily. Today you need it. I can see it in the way you're sitting in this house alone, doing work meant for 3 people, missing a man you sent away, and a child who wrote her first word on your kitchen floor. You need to know that what you felt wasn't a lie. It was 2 men loving you at the same time through the same pen, and one of them is still alive. He stood, placed his cup in the basin, and put on his hat. I'm just the mailman, Miss Whitfield. I deliver the message. What you do with it is between you and Maughan and a man who's probably sitting in his own cold cabin right now wondering if he'll ever see you again. He left on his mule, and Thea stood on the porch and watched him grow small against the snow, and the world was very still. She did not go that day. She needed the night. She spent it sitting by the fire with the letters and the watch and Wren's drawing and Lorna's doll arranged on the table before her, like the elements of an equation she was finally learning to solve. She read the letters one more time than all 14, but this time she read them differently. She heard Emmett in the rough edges, in the practical observations about land and weather. And she heard Beckett in the spaces between, in the longing, in the beauty, in the ache of a man writing love letters he could never sign. 2 voices, 1 conversation, both real. She put the letters in the wooden box with the pocket watch and the photograph of Emmett and Wren's drawing. She closed the lid. A family's relics gathered from different lives, different losses, fitting together in the imperfect way that real things fit. She slept, and in the morning she saddled the bay mare and rode west. Beckett's ranch was 2 miles from Emmett's, but the snow made it feel like 20. Thea picked her way along the road, the mare stepping carefully through drifts that came up past her hocks. The sky was the pale, washed blue that comes after heavy snow, and the mountains stood sharp and white against it, and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe, and so clean it felt like drinking from a spring. She saw the cabin before she saw the smoke, and for a moment her heart seized because there was no smoke. The chimney was cold. The yard was empty. No horse in the corral. No tracks in the snow except the faint parallel lines of sled runners leading away from the door and down the road. She dismounted and went to the cabin. The door was unlocked. Inside, the rooms were stripped. The bedrolls gone, the few dishes washed and stacked, the stove cold and cleaned of ash. On the table, a single sheet of paper held down by a stone. She picked it up. The handwriting was Beckett's, the same hand that had written 14 letters and 100 fence post notes and 1 passage about sunsets that had made her cry on a rented bed in Harrisburg. But the words were different from anything he had written before. They were bare, unpracticed. The words of a man writing without the shelter of another man's name. Thea, I'm writing this letter under my own name. It is the first honest letter I have written in a year, and I find that honesty makes a poor stylist. The words don't come as easy when you can't hide behind someone else. I love you. I have loved you since the 3rd letter, when you wrote about loneliness being a brighter rectangle on a wall where a picture used to hang. I read that sentence and knew that you understood something I had been trying to say since Lorna died, and could not find the shape of. I loved Emmett too. He was the best man I knew, and I repaid his friendship by falling in love with his bride. I told myself I was helping him. I told myself the words were his, and I was only the instrument. But instruments don't ache when they play, and I ached with every letter. Wren spoke today, not out loud, but she wrote a word in her book. She wrote home, and when I asked her what it meant, she pointed in the direction of your ranch, not mine, yours. I'm leaving because you asked me to, and because I think you were right to ask. But I am also leaving because staying would mean watching you from across a fence line for the rest of my life, close enough to hear your voice, but too far to answer. and I have done enough of that through letters to last a lifetime. Don't look for us. You deserve to be loved by someone who didn't start with a lie. Beckett. Thea read the letter twice, then as she folded it, put it in her pocket next to Wren's drawing, and went back outside. The sled tracks led south toward the main road toward town, toward the train station where coaches departed for points east and west, and anywhere that was not here. He was running. The same pattern that had brought him to Wyoming in the first place, the pattern of a man who believed that leaving was the same as protecting that absence was a form of love. She mounted the mare and followed the tracks. She found them 2 miles south at the crossroads where the valley road met the stage route. Beckett had stopped, not because he had changed his mind, but because Wren had climbed down from the sled and was sitting in the snow beside the road, refusing to move. The child sat with her arms crossed and her chin set and her eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance with the absolute immovable stubbornness that only a 7-year-old can achieve. The cloth doll, a new one that Beckett must have fashioned from scraps, sat beside her in the snow. Beckett stood over his daughter, his hands at his sides, his face showing the particular helplessness of a parent confronting a will stronger than his own. Thea reined in the mare. Beckett looked up. The expression on his face was something she would remember for the rest of her life, hope and terror and shame and longing all braided together so tightly that none of them could be separated from the others. She dismounted. She walked past him without speaking. She knelt in the snow beside Wren. The cold soaked through her skirt immediately, but she did not stand. Wren looked at her, those gray eyes, Lorna's eyes full of everything the child could not say and everything she desperately needed someone to hear. Thea reached into her pocket and took out the drawing. She unfolded it and held it so Wren could see. The house, the empty page, the shaky letters at the bottom. Home. You wrote this, Thea said softly. Your first word. Do you know how extraordinary that is? Wren's lower lip trembled. You've been listening all this time. Watching me write, watching your father write. Learning how to make words without anyone teaching you. You taught yourself Wren. The way your mother taught your father, the way he taught himself to write letters that made a woman in Pennsylvania believe she could start over. She reached out and brushed snow from the child's hair. You wrote home, and you're right, that's what it is. Not my cabin or your father's cabin. It's wherever the three of us are together, that's what home means. Wren's mouth opened, her lips formed a shape. No sound came out. She tried again, her small throat working, her eyes squeezing shut with the effort. And then, like a door opening after a long winter, like ice breaking on a spring creek, like the first green thing pushing through the last of the snow. Mama Thea. 2 words, barely a whisper, a voice rusty from 8 months of disuse cracking on the consonants, fragile as a new leaf, but unmistakable and unstoppable. Because once the door was open, it could not be closed again. Thea pulled the child into her arms and held her, and the snow soaked through her clothes, and she did not care. Wren's small body shook with the effort of breaking through her own silence, and her arms came up around Thea's neck with a fierceness that was almost painful. Behind them, Beckett stood motionless, his hands hung at his sides. His face had gone very still, the way a man's face goes still when something he thought was lost forever comes back. Thea looked up at him over Wren's shoulder. I read your letter, she said. He said nothing. You wrote that I deserve someone who didn't start with a lie. She stood lifting Wren with her, the child clinging to her like a small, determined barnacle. You don't get to decide what I deserve, and you don't get to decide for her either. She reached into her other pocket and took out the pocket watch. She held it up so he could see the case, the cracked crystal, the scratch marks on the inside. Emmett carved 2 words in this watch, for her. He didn't need you to write that. He didn't need anyone. He just needed a knife and something to say. She closed the watch. And Crane told me what Emmett said before he died, that the voice in the letters belongs to a good man, that if he couldn't love me himself, he wanted you to love me for both of you. Beckett's jaw worked. His eyes were bright and he was fighting it and losing. I don't know how to stay, he said. The words came out rough, broken, nothing like the fluid sentences he put on paper. Every time I care about something, I lose it. Lorna, Emmett, you, every time I run, it's the only thing I know how to do well. That's not true. You know how to write letters that make a lonely woman in Pennsylvania believe the world still has room for her. You know how to raise a daughter so gentle she brings water to a stranger. You know how to mend fences and gentle horses and show up every morning at 5 o'clock to help a woman who never asked for help because you knew she needed it. She took a step toward him. You know how to do 100 things, Beckett. You just don't know how to stop running. So we'll learn that together. The way I learned to ride. Badly at first, with someone standing close enough to catch me. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had changed. The thing behind his eyes that had been running since Lorna died, and maybe before that, since his mother died when he was 12, and taught him the first lesson of loss. That thing slowed, stumbled, stopped. He let go of the sled rope. It was a small gesture. Just his fingers opening the leather strap falling to the snow. But it was everything. It was a man releasing the habit of leaving, choosing instead the harder, braver, more terrifying act of standing still. Wren, still in Thea's arms, reached out one hand toward her father. He took it. And for a moment, the three of them stood at the crossroads in the snow, connected by touch, by choice, by the stubborn refusal to let loss have the final word. "Take us home," Wren whispered. Her second sentence, 4 syllables, a complete thought. Beckett looked at Thea. Thea looked at Beckett. And between them, a child who had been silent for 8 months spoke for the third time. "Both homes," she said, "together." The road back was long and cold, and neither of them pretended it was easy. They did not touch again that day, not after the crossroads. There was too much still unsettled, too many conversations that needed to happen in warm rooms with full stomachs and rested minds. But they rode side by side, Wren bundled on the sled behind Beckett's horse. Thea on the bay mare, and the silence between them was different from every silence that had come before. It was not the silence of secrets or of grief or of anger. It was the silence of two people who had said the hardest things and survived them. When they reached the ranch, Thea went inside to build up the fire. Beckett tended the horses. Wren sat on the porch steps with Lorna's doll recovered from the chair where she had left it a week ago and spoke to it softly, testing her voice, the way a person tests a healing limb, carefully, wonderingly, with the expectation of pain that gradually gives way to the surprise of its absence. "We're back," she told the doll. "We're back, and Mama Thea said we could stay." That evening they ate together at the kitchen table. 3 bowls, 3 cups, 3 spoons. The same configuration Thea had set that first night 3 months ago, and every night since, and the night she had set only one, and felt the absence of the other 2 like phantom limbs. Wren fell asleep on the hearth rug with the doll under her chin and one of the barn kittens curled against her stomach. Beckett and Thea sat across from each other in the firelight. 2 people at the beginning of something that had no precedent and no guarantee. "It won't be easy," Thea said. "No. I'm still angry. You should be. But I'm also tired of being angry. I'm tired of this house being empty. I'm tired of reading letters from a dead man and hearing your voice." She reached across the table and took the wooden box from the shelf. She opened it and placed the contents between them. The letters, the pocket watch, Wren's drawing, the photograph of Emmett. "These belong to our family," she said. "All of them. Emmett, Lorna, you, me, Wren. Nobody's missing. Nobody's replaced. We carry all of them." Beckett looked at the collection on the table. His eyes settled on the photograph of Emmett, and something shifted in his face, some weight that he had been carrying for months, finally finding a place to rest. "He told me to love you for both of us," Beckett said quietly. "I think he knew me better than I knew myself. He knew you couldn't say it in your own name, so he gave you his. And now you practice saying it in yours." He was quiet for a long time. The fire burned low. Wren breathed softly on the rug, the kitten purring against her ribs. "I love you," Beckett said. No flourish, no poetry. 3 words stripped of everything that had made his letters beautiful, left standing plain and bare and true. The way fence posts stand in a field, simple and necessary, and holding up the wire that keeps everything from scattering. Thea reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "That's a start," she said. Spring came slowly to the Wind River Valley, the way it always does in Wyoming, arguing with winter for weeks before finally winning the ground. The snow retreated in patches, revealing mud first, then brown grass, then green, then wildflowers in colors so vivid they looked painted. Thea stood on the porch on a morning in May watching Beckett teach Wren to rope a fence post. The girl's technique was improving. Her arm was sure, her timing patient. She threw the loop and it sailed through the clean air and settled over the post with a satisfying snap. Again, Beckett said. Can I try a calf next time? When you're ready, all things in their time. Thea smiled at the phrase. It had become something between them, a shorthand for the slow, patient work of building trust from the ruins of deception. All things in their time. The forgiveness that came not in a single dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small ones. The morning Beckett reached for her hand and she let him hold it. The evening she read one of the letters aloud and they talked about it, honestly separating what was his from what was Emmett's, honoring both. The night Wren called her Mama Thea at the supper table, and Beckett looked at her across the child's head with an expression that needed no letters to translate. On the shelf above the fireplace, the wooden box held its collection of relics, the letters retied with their blue ribbon, the pocket watch with "For Her" scratched inside, the photograph of Emmett, Wren's drawing with its single shaky word, and a new addition, the letter Beckett had written under his own name, the ugly, honest, unpoetic letter that said, "I love you," without any craft or disguise, the truest thing he had ever put on paper. Thea opened her journal and wrote the last entries she would make before the new life swallowed the old one completely. I came to Wyoming to marry a man I had never met. I found his grave instead. But from that grave grew something he had planted without knowing it. A family made not from blood or law, but from the stubborn decision to choose each other every morning. Emmett gave me his land. Beckett gave me his words. Wren gave me her silence, and then when she was ready, her voice. And I gave them the only thing I had left, a heart that had been empty so long, it had forgotten its own shape, and 3 people who filled it in ways I could never have predicted. I did not marry the man who wrote the letters. I married the voices near them, and the voice turned out to belong to someone real, someone flawed, someone who started with a lie and learned slowly to tell the truth. Just as I started as a stranger and learned slowly to become a mother, just as a silent child learned slowly to speak. All things in their time, and our time is now. She closed the journal. Outside, Wren's laughter carried across the yard, bright and unrestrained, the laughter of a child who has found her voice and intends to use it. Beckett's deeper voice answered, patient and warm. The cattle moved in the near pasture. The creek ran clear with snowmelt, and the cottonwood by Emmett's grave was putting out new leaves, pale green against the deep blue Wyoming sky. Thea touched the pocket watch in her apron. For Her, 2 words carved by a man who could not write poetry, but who understood better than anyone that love does not require eloquence. It requires only the willingness to try and the courage to let someone else finish what you started. She went inside to start supper. 3 plates, 3 cups, 3 settings at a table built by a dead man's hands, used by the living, honored by the love that passed through it daily, like light through a window, ordinary and sustaining and enough. Outside, the wind moved through the valley, carrying with it the scent of sage and new grass, and the distant sound of a child's voice speaking, singing, filling the silence that had held her for so long, with words she was only beginning to discover. And in the barn pinned to the wall beside the feed schedule and the worming calendar, a piece of paper fluttered in the draft. A child's drawing of a house, small and square, with smoke rising from the chimney. No people in the picture, no names. Just the house, and beneath it, in letters that wobbled but held a single word that meant everything: home.